Welcome to American History Gazette. Today we are joined by Kolby Lanham, the senior researcher and historian at the Alamo. The Battle of the Alamo was one of the most infamous and formative events in Texas history, and therefore American history. It produced iconic images and figures such as the Come and Take It flag and the legendary Davy Crockett. So join us as we unravel how a small outpost became one of the most infamous battle sites in America. Enjoy the episode. Well, Kolby, welcome to American History Gazette.
Hey, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
All right. Now, the Battle of the Alamo is the topic of discussion today, but I think we need to delve into some context and some build-up to the Battle of the Alamo beforehand to understand the stakes and what was going on. And I'd like to backtrack to post-Mexicans' War for Independence. There's a lot of political turmoil in Mexico. So just walk me through the political scene in Mexico. I know there's some centralization of power going on. The right wing kind of takes over. So just walk me through the political scene in Mexico leading up to the Texas Revolution.
To accurately, place you in the right place, you really got to go back to when Spain is defeated by the Mexican people in 1821, and that is really the independence movement of the Mexican people against the Spanish government. Spain is removed from the scene, and it creates a very large power vacuum. In the time, that we have four presidents in the United States, they will have 13 presidents in Mexico, and so actually more than that, and it's a revolving door where the Mexican people are trying to find a stable government that'll work for them, government for the people, by the people, and it's a very dangerous place to be if you want to be a president of Mexico, because they are not only being forced in and out of power, they're being killed, forcibly removed, and so the turmoil is very real, and you have to think about it from the Mexican person's perspective, the average citizen, they start to wonder if they've made a mistake, and trying to self-govern, and so it's a pretty tumultuous place.
Yeah, anytime throughout history when we see sort of a post-revolution, there's always, I guess with the exception of the United States, I mean, the United States had some turmoil, but I think we handled the situation pretty well in terms of self-government. But I mean, you look at Napoleon, you look at Haiti, during the U.S. occupation of Haiti, there's always that, like you said, it's a dangerous time to be presidents. They're always being forced out, assassinated. But at this time, Texas is still part of Mexico. The whole Texas region, that's considered Mexico at this point. But there's an open border between Mexican-controlled Texas and the actual United States. And there's a lot of immigrants coming in from the United States as part of the westward expansion. And I just want to get into the role that immigration played and the open border when it came to the Texas Revolution and kind of the situation in Texas at that time, because they're going through a sort of identity shift with all these American immigrants coming to Texas.
Yeah, Mexico has the same problem that Spain had before them, in the sense that you have this vast territory north of the Rio Grande, and how do you populate that area? One of the censuses shows is a stagnant population of about 10,000 people living in the entirety of Texas. And for the listeners and viewers, you have to remember that Texas was not its current size at that time. It was half of New Mexico, part of Colorado, Wyoming, a little bit of Oklahoma. And so it was a very large, vast territory, and there's only 10,000 people living there. So Spain tries to fix this problem by allowing immigration, and Mexico kind of adopts the same policy. But there are some rules the Mexican government's put out there. They don't want the dregs of American and European society coming in to populate their northernmost state. They want good, pioneering people. A couple, like, three main rules they wanted to apply to these new settlers and immigrants is they wanted people to at least try to become Catholic. They weren't trying to force anyone to Catholicism, but they really wanted people to attend Mass and try to become Catholic. They wanted people to bring letters of good standing from judges and sheriffs and other people in high places from the United States and Europe, showing these people weren't crooks or criminals. A couple of those letters still exist. They're at the Alamo today. We have one from New York. for one of the Alamo defenders. And the third and final thing is that they wanted people to renounce their American or European citizenship and become Mexican citizens. They want these people to become Mexican citizens into the fold. And a lot of those immigrants do that. There are some that do not, that illegally come, they squat on Mexican land. It causes serious issues with the Mexican government. Today, whenever you talk about Texas, a lot of people refer to the Mexican people living here as Tejanos, right? It's a native-born Mexican that is living in Texas. That takes a huge shift in the 80s and becomes a more of an ethnic term. But during this period in 1836, Tejanos were anyone living within Texas. So these are now Mexican citizens, regardless of where they were born. And so Mexico, they allow these people down into Texas, but the issue becomes that Mexico City is far removed from Texas, and they can't regulate that population. And when they send another person up there to try to see how it's going, he writes back and says, we have a serious problem. The Mexican people are outnumbered 5-1. And so we've allowed far too many people in. We can't regulate it. And so they try to stem the flow of immigration. But because they could never regulate it in the first place, they're not successful in regulating it the second time.
Yeah, that's always a problem that I feel like large empires run into is they have their capital, but since the empire is so large, it's hard to regulate their policy and their laws on the outskirts. You know what I mean? But what about slavery? Because I know slavery was also an issue here. From what I understand, slavery was outlawed in Mexico, but because of these American immigrants coming to Texas, they were bringing slaves with them. And I know that sparked a lot more conflict between them and the Mexican government.
So it's kind of it's a misconception that slavery was outlawed during this period because what happens is Guerrero outlaws slavery in 1829 through a series of decrees using extraordinary powers with the threat of reinvasion of Spain into Mexico. So they're thinking Spain's going to reinvade, so he gets all these extra powers. He's using those extra powers that are granted to him to pass other laws, and one of them is to outlaw chattel slavery. Now, it's important to note, he's talking specifically about the African slave trade, not the several other forms of slavery happening within Mexico from the Yucatan all the way through to California and New Mexico. Coerced labor, the hacienda system, all these other different types of labor will remain in their slavery, just under a different name. And so he passes this decree, and then it doesn't last, I think it's less than a year, and that is reversed. So slavery is still allowed, and there's an exception made for Texas. And, it's not to say that there weren't Mexican people who were vehemently opposed to slavery. They were. But they also saw the opportunities of allowing immigrants into that area to bolster the economy. And so the Mexican government and the people are kind of doing this number, trying to figure out what the happy medium is there. Mexico doesn't actually outlaw slavery until 1837, after the Texas Revolution, and Texas becomes its own nation. And even then, those other institutions are still allowed. And the major difference there, and some of them, is that they're exactly as chattel slavery, except they couldn't sell your children. And so, when people talk about slavery and the role it played, I think it's important to put those perspectives out there. There are people who are feeling pressure from the American government now that the importation of new slaves is not allowed in the United States, and they're worried. The government's going to completely abolish slavery, which we know is going to happen with the Civil War and after. And so they see Texas as kind of a haven, and we do have people bringing slaves to Texas. We've also got abolitionists moving to Texas who are vehemently against it. And so it does play a role. To say that there was no one in the Texas Revolution fighting for the institution of slavery would be patently false. But it's also equally false to say that this had a gigantic impact on the revolution itself, because if you were to list them out like 1 through 15, I would put slavery near the bottom as a causation of the Texas Revolution.
Okay, interesting. Well, I'm glad that's clarified. When it comes to sort of Texas identity, when did all these Texans moving into Mexican-controlled Texas start to form their own identity? Because at a certain point, there's a boiling point where you kind of cross the line, and then these Texans say, we feel like our own state now. So when exactly did the animosity start to kind of brew over between the Texans and the Mexican government, where they say, hey, we kind of want our own state now?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the people, it's important to know that the people who are moving here are the pioneering type. They're the ones who have already kind of they've they've removed themselves from American society and become their own thing. Like the people living in Kentucky were vastly different from those living in Philadelphia, right? And the wilderness of Kentucky and Tennessee. And
Yeah.
so when encroachment on their land and their ideas and the way they live starts happening from the East Coast, they migrate down to Texas. So the people who are coming here are already very, they're self-reliant. They have ideas about who they are. And when they come to Texas, those ideas don't really change. However, the initial push of revolution happens in Mexico, right? Lower Mexico, and spreads into Texas. Texas revolution is not standing on its own two legs. It is part of a much larger revolution that starts in Lower Mexico and boils over into Texas. Texans kind of find themselves between a rock and a hard place. Do we back the government we swore to uphold, or do we back our neighbors who are being attacked by the Mexican government and the army under Santana? It's about December of 1835 when that idea starts to shift from, hey, we're part of this big revolution, to, you know what, it's probably better that we just fully separate and become our own nation. And so, yeah, it's very early on in the very short-lived revolution.
Interesting. So, what sparked this revolution down in, Upper Mexico, these neighbors of Texas? What was it that sparked the revolution? Was it just a carryover of the political turmoil following their war for independence?
It's some of it. And it's definitely multi-causal. But I would put the chief issue would be the election of Santana as president. When he, people say he takes over the Mexican government. He's elected. He's duly elected. So it's not a hostile takeover. He's elected into that position. But what he does after that, turning the government from federalism, which he claimed to have backed, to centralism, is a major issue. The Mexican people didn't trade a tyrant in Europe for one in their own backyard, so they're not very happy about that, and that's what causes the revolutions. The Texans are kind of watching it, and it isn't really till the sacking of Zacatecas by the Mexican army, which is a very nasty affair, that the Texans say, you know what, we're going to go ahead and join this revolution. And you'll hear people sometimes talk about this as the Texas War for Independence. We could argue that point, but what I tell visitors all the time is that the difference between a war and a revolution is, in a war, the government tells you who to fight. In a revolution, you pick your own enemy. And that's what the Mexican people have done. They've identified the issue, and they're trying to fix it.
That's a very profound distinction. That's a great quote. Yeah, very very insightful. That definitely puts it into perspective, the difference between war and revolution.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
I'm glad you brought up Santa Anna, because obviously he's a very important player here in the Texas Revolution and the Battle of the Alamo. I'd like to flesh him out a little more, because I know he claimed himself to be the Napoleon of the West. So that kind of puts in perspective the mindset and the type of person he is. Like you said, he gets duly elected, but he starts centralizing power. So just, who was Santa Anna as a person and as a leader?
Yeah, great question. So when we think about this and we see that he's the head of Mexico, we think he's Mexican. He's not. He's upper crust Spanish. I wouldn't call him quite nobility, but he was of the affluent class, and he is initially fighting against Mexico in their third bid for independence. And when he sees that the tide is turning against Spain, he switches sides and joins the Mexican people. He is very, very much a man of opportunity. If he sees that the wind's blowing one way or another, he's going to switch. And he does that. And he fights with the Mexican people and becomes one of them. And so he's also seen a lot of warfare. A lot of people label him as a coward. I would not put him in a coward category. I mean, he's seen some very nasty warfare, and he's not hiding in the back of the far back lines, especially early on in his military career. And so he becomes, a Mexican citizen. He's a person of the people, and he touts this. The people end up electing him, and the Mexican people are going to pay for that in a very sad way. Yeah, it's that's who he is, kind of in a nutshell. I mean, he'll bend wherever the wind blows, and there's a reason he lives until his 80s. because he's able to see things that other people aren't able to see. And there's a reason he's a president, dictator, or general of Mexico somewhere around 11 to 13 times.
Interesting. So would you describe him as sort of a power hungry opportunist?
Um, yeah, but it's also the opportunity is there. I mean, it presents itself to him. I mean,
Yeah.
there are times when he's not actually looking to go back and he's drugged back into the fold. A great one is when the United States government approaches him after Texas is annexed by the United States in 1845, and they want him to go in and try to quell any hostilities that might break out. And so they get him to go to Mexico and try to fix this problem and smooth things over, and he absolutely gets right back into power, and we end up fighting one of the bloodiest wars in American history, and now known as the Mexican-American War.
Wow. That's so interesting. I'd like to get into one of the most iconic symbols that have come out of the Texas Revolution, and that is the "Come and Take It" flag. Everyone knows the "Come and Take It" flag with the cannon on it, and it's used a lot today to protest Second Amendment rights. But from what I understand, this sort of came as a symbol and a spark that started the Texas Revolution, or one of the sparks that started the Texas Revolution, and that was over this cannon that the Mexican government lended to the Texans to help um, quell any Native American uprisings or conflicts. And when they asked for it back, the Texans didn't want to give it back, and that's what birthed the "Come and Take It" flag. Was come and take this cannon from a sort of a challenge. So just walk me through the story of the "Come and Take It" flag, and that story that helped sparked a lot of conflict between Texas and the Mexican government.
Yeah, so going back to the other point I made earlier is that this is a very large revolution starting in lower Mexico, boiling over into Texas, which was a Mexican state. The Mexican government foresees a very large issue that Texas is going to join the rest of these revolting states. So what they do is they pass an act called the Militia Reduction Act in March of 1835. And the Militia Reduction Act has several different portions to it, but one of those portions is that you can only own one firearm per every 500 men. And they wanted to centralize all the heavy artillery into certain places. And the central location for Texas, at least one of them, is going to be Bejar, was early San Antonio. And so General Coast and other men before him are trying to gather up all these these cannons. Coast comes into a little later, but the Mexican Army starts gathering up all the firearms and weapons, and they know that the people of Gonzales have a large 6-pound bronze gun on loan. And so they send 100 men under a young lieutenant named Castaneda, to go and retrieve that gun. They are given explicit orders: do not fire on the Texans. Do not start a fight with them. If they don't run, give the gun up, or if they start shooting at you, just run. So when they show up, and it takes several, I want to say it's over a 3-day period, but I need to check that. It takes quite some time, and they're bargaining, going back and forth, and eventually shots are fired. It's foggy. The Texans miss. The Mexican Army misses, and they fire this cannon at the Mexican Army. The Mexican Army does exactly as they're told, and they vacate the area. And the Texans throw up their hands and say, "We've won." During that, talking back and forth, a flag has been raised of a picture of a cannon, and the words "Come and Take It." And so that flag becomes very popular. The Texans believe they've won this battle. It's really a skirmish. And of course, the Mexican Army is doing exactly as they're told. They leave. There were 100 of them, and they probably could have overtaken the Texans, but they were following orders. And so they get back to San Antonio, and kind of all hell breaks loose. Texans start gathering in Gonzales and other places. They join the newly formed Texian army, and it marches on Bejar.
Yeah, it's sort of a false summit per se, because the Texans kind of kick the Mexicans out after this small skirmish, and they sort of say, we won, but little do they know that Santa Anna is going to come back with vengeance. Take no prisoner. He labels them pirates. But I'm interested to hear, what did the U.S. government think of all of this going on? Because there's a lot of American immigrants in Texas. There's this conflict, this revolution arising between the Texans and the Mexican government, and obviously these immigrants are from America. They're bordering America. So what does the U.S. government, I believe Andrew Jackson's the president at the time, what does he think of this conflict that's uprising?
America has not stepped and dipped their foot into the world stage at this point. Our military is pretty small. Our Navy is very small. They're watching from afar and they're interested, especially since Sam Houston's going to be involved in this and he's a protege to Andrew Jackson. But the American government is not getting involved, and they've been pretty specific about that. They've even said that American citizens are not to send aid in the form of firearms and weapons to the Texas Revolution. So the government wants to stay square out of this. They don't want to get into a war with their southern neighbor.
Interesting. So they just have sort of a hands-off policy, observing the situation. I want to move to the Alamo, which is obviously the topic of discussion. What exactly was the Alamo as a location prior to the Battle of the Alamo? What did the Alamo serve as up until this time?
Yeah, so the Alamo serves as one of 5 Spanish colonial missions in San Antonio that the Spanish formed to help populate the area. It's all centralized around the San Antonio River, so there's a body of water. There are already indigenous people living here. They set up these missions in hopes that they could convert them to Catholicism, assimilate them into Spanish culture, teach them a trade, in hopes that they would go outside the mission, build a home, and the town would grow. And it does work. These 5 missions are somewhat successful, depending on how you measure success. And from that point on, the town continues to grow, but they have another need. Now that you have a town, you have to defend that town. And so this old mission, known as Mission San Antonio de Valero, is converted into a fort by the Spanish Army and then continued to be used as such by the Mexican Army and, of course, by the Texans.
So it's already a fort by the time the Texas Revolution comes around?
Yep, it had already been established as a fort by Spain, and then Mexico bolsters those defenses whenever they win their independence. Cannon are added. There are some defensive breastwork that are added, and so the Mexican Army does the majority of work to really turn this into a somewhat formidable place.
Interesting. So at what point do the Texans realize this is a place to defend? I mean, this is a very small former Catholic mission. It's a very small military outpost. What exactly is the strategic importance of the Alamo, and why are the Texans, putting men in supplies, albeit not very many men in supplies here, to defend it?
The key to Texas during this period, and some people may argue differently, is Behar, what is now San Antonio. It has 6 highways that culminate all in one spot, which is directly in front of the Alamo. The King's Highways, or what we call the El Camino de Real. And so these series of highways all come to a head in San Antonio right in front of the Alamo. And so it is the key to Texas. It's all things political and military. And so if you can hold the Alamo, you can hold the town. And if you can, but you can't have one without the other. So if you want to hold the town, you got to hold the fort. If you want to hold the fort, you got to have the town. So that's why people are fighting over it. And that, I want to get off topic here, but that trend continues long after the Battle of the Alamo is over with. Mexico reinvades San Antonio in September 11th, 1842. And it is, well, what many consider to be the most conquered city in the United States.
What exactly is the state of the Alamo? Once these Texans decide that this is necessary to defend in order to defend San Antonio, they send men and supplies here, but from my understanding, it's like 150 guys. It's not very well equipped. There's not a lot of guns here. There's not a lot of, it's not built, it's a Spanish mission. It's not built for battle. They don't have shooting ports. They have to stand up over the wall. So just walk me through the condition that the Alamo's in terms of military defense.
Yeah. You made several good points. The Alamo is a fort out of pure necessity. Green B. Jameson, the engineer for the Texans, had grand plans to try to square it off like a more typical fort of the period and leave out most of the southern or the northern part of the compound and make it a more formidable square, something they could defend with a small number of men. Something similar to like Presidio La Bahia and Goliad. That never actually comes to fruition, probably due to a lack of men, lack of supplies, and a lack of time. But the fort itself, what is standing whenever the Texans take it over after the Battle of Behar in December of 1835, you got to remember, is a mission first, and it was built in 1724, starting in 24. The other buildings come a little bit later, and it's slowly built up. And so by the time 1836 rolls around, you're talking about a very old series of structures
Yeah.
that are mostly made out of, kind of adobe and thatch roof and some bricks, but they're not built with a military intention.
Yeah, and that'll end up kind of biting the defenders in the butt because it's so difficult to defend. They end up being quite easily overrun, although they do fight very valiantly. But back to Santa Anna. After these Texans are rebelling, they are openly against the Mexican government at this point. He labels them as pirates and as land pirates and signals that he will be taking no prisoners. So he treks back to Texas with the aim of taking San Antonio, taking the Alamo. Just what exactly is Santa Anna's mission here? What's his mindset when it comes to taking the Alamo?
His mindset, he knows how important the Alamo is. Its strategic location. He knows that by defeating them, it's going to be a serious blow to Texas morale. Um, he does have kind of an edict that he's carrying with him of no quarter will be given to any of these people, because labeling them as pirates means that they're not really soldiers and they're not recognizing the Texas government. So these people they're rebels basically. And so by labeling them as such, they're not given any of the same privileges that a soldier in war would be given. And so it's Santa Anna's orders, but he's following someone above him, because even though Santa Anna was in charge of Mexico prior to the revolution, he has to step down out of power as president to become the head of the military, which means he can't be both. So now he has someone above him, and a man named Tornell passes a decree called the Tornell Decree. And the Tornell Decree means that you will put prisoners to death, and that's the justification Santana will use whenever he puts the men at the Alamo to death, and the ones orders the ones at Goliad to also be killed.
Speaking of the Texas government, when exactly? Because we know at this period of time, it's known as the Republic of Texas or the Texas Republic. Did they get together and draft up a constitution for the Republic of Texas? When exactly did they legitimize themselves as an independent state?
Yeah, so you can look at several different instances of where they're gathering and making claim to certain things, but it really kind of comes to head in early March. And so by early March, Sam Houston is put completely in power of both the regulars and the volunteers. They have a convention. They've claimed themselves as independent, and it's a pivotal point for Texas because Sam Houston had been installed as the head of the army before, but it was only over one's regulars, no volunteers. Well, at the time, the entire Texas Army is basically volunteers,
Yeah.
or at least a large portion of it. And so it left him with really no army. This kind of feeds into I don't want to get off topic, but I think it's important to say.
No, feel free. Feel
Into,
free.
Okay, it leads into a kind of a common myth that the men at the Alamo fought and died at the Battle of the Alamo to give Sam Houston time to build his army. And really what's happening is that there is no army. And when the Alamo falls, Sam Houston gets basically full control in early March to start building this army. But when the Alamo falls, he has basically no one. And so he starts building the army. And so, yeah, it's the early part of 1836 that Texas really defines himself and drafts the Constitution and claims itself as independent. The whole revolution, for everyone listening, lasts about 11 months. So it's bang, 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 very quick.
Yeah. It is, as in the words of Santa Anna, when talking about the Alamo, I think we can apply this to the whole affair. He says, it was but a small affair. And we'll get into that after the Battle of the Alamo. But I think Santa Anna's trek to San Antonio, to the Alamo, is an important point to make. It shouldn't be glossed over, because as he travels through Mexico, he had the option to go by sea and kind of sail up the coast, but he decided to go by land. And It was a very treacherous um, travel. He was forcibly picking up soldiers. I know he had forced conscription. He was picking up villagers to travel along. There was horrible weather conditions. And I think that this really will show the dichotomy between the soldiers of the Mexican army versus the Texans, because the Texans are fighting for independence. They have purpose. They know what they're fighting for. And a lot of these Mexican soldiers are being forced to be there. They don't necessarily care what they're fighting for. So walk me through Santa Anna's travels through Mexico to the Alamo, and sort of the difference between the Mexican soldier and the Texas defender.
Yeah. So Mexico's army. Okay. So it needs to be said. So the Mexican army is the largest army in North America at the time. Um, the upper echelon of officers and senior NCOs is actually really good. A lot of them had been Spanish soldiers before that and had great training. The younger soldiers are somewhat green, but they still had some pretty elite units. The conscripts that are being brought into the army, they are mostly untrained, but there's not a ton of them. The Mexican army was a professional fighting force. What plagues them on their trip northward is two main things. The logistical issues that they're going to incur that are somewhat self-inflicted, and weather. And if you look at Napoleon, what did he say about the army and supply? An army lives on its stomach. So you got to have food, you got to have supplies, you got to have rations. The issue is that Santana is in such a rush to get north that he doesn't allow his officers and senior NCOs to really get everything squared away. And if you read some of the journals from the Mexican officers, they're talking about how little time they had to get everything together, and they voiced these concerns, and they were told to press on. And that's going to really play terribly for them on their march north, where they had to march through a large mountain range. They hit a really nasty blizzard. I believe it's De La Pena, a Mexican officer, who talks about when they stop and this blizzard sets upon them, that he says the men neglected their duties as soldiers. Yeah, they're chopping down trees. They're trying to get stuff to build fires, and they neglect all of the livestock, the horses, the donkeys, the mules that are carrying their supplies. Gunpowder gets soaked and wet. Some of the mules are left with their cargo, and they are exhausted. They're falling. They're breaking their faces and their necks. They're basically dying off. And the Mexican soldiers are trying to save their own lives. And so when I say it's a menagerie of death, and really it really is. It's a nasty, nasty affair, and it's a manufacturer of misery for the Mexican army. And so by the time they get up and across the Rio Grande River and they get into Texas, the Mexican army have been fighting for quite some time. Really, if you think about it, some of these men have been fighting since Mexican independence in 1821. So you're talking about a long dang time to be fighting. And then not to mention this campaign, which weighs heavily on the Mexican army to the point of near a breaking point. And when they get to the Alamo, in some cases, they're used as cannon fodder by Santana. He makes a reference to his men as that they're, and I'll paraphrase because I don't know the exact verbiage, but he says something about his men, the life of a soldier is that of but a chicken. So, expendable.
Wow. That's terrible. Manufacturer of misery is a great way to put it. I mean, God, that would suck. I can't imagine how much that would suck. I mean,
yeah, pretty awful.
You're on foot, on mules, on horses, maybe traveling across Mexico, across mountains. You're starving. The weather's terrible. I mean, that would be horrible. And then it also contributes to the disparity between morale. I mean, by the time these guys get to the Alamo, they're done. They're spent. They're exhausted. They're tired of this. They're hungry. And these Texas defenders, they're ready to defend, what they consider their homeland, an independent state. They're fighting a revolution. So
yeah, and then Mexico is looking at it as, well, this land is ours, so there's this tug of war happening. The Texans are also wanting for supplies as well. They didn't have to endure what the Mexican army endured, but they are slim on supplies. They have hardly any clothes, and so they're hurting as well. The only area they're really kind of set well in is They have a lot of artillery. There's more artillery in that fort in the Alamo than any other fort west of the Mississippi at the time. They have lots of small arms that were left behind by the Mexican army at the defeat of General Cos in December of 1835. They've got gunpowder. They need men, and they need food, and they need clothing. So, yeah.
Yeah, by the time Santa Anna and his army get there, there's only what, like 150 guys at the Alamo?
Yeah, so about 150. There are 32 men from the town of Gonzales. It brings the number to roughly 189 known names. There could be more than that.
Huh. Interesting. So once Santa Anna arrives at the Alamo with his army, what are sort of the first steps he takes? I know it's what, a 13-day siege. So he gets there, he starts setting up camps. Does he try to achieve any sort of diplomatic ends? Does he sort of try to negotiate a surrender, or is this just raise the red flag, we're going to war?
So Santana will fully surround the city. The Texans vacate the town they had fought so hard for in December. They go inside the Alamo and they barricade themselves inside, knowing that it's easier to hold that fort than it would be to hold a cluster of houses against a superior force. So they're inside. The Mexican army's in the town. It's about 800 yards away. James Bowie goes out to try and work out a deal. James Bowie is a longtime Mexican citizen. He'd been here, I think, roughly 11 years or 10 years before the revolution even starts. He's baptized Catholic in a town, or in a church here in town. He marries into a Mexican family. He speaks fluent Spanish, so he knows a lot of these people. And that doesn't work out. And a cannon shot is fired, and basically all bets are off. The red flag of no quarter is raised. Santana does allow kind of a ceasefire for women and children to leave the fort. The Mexican army is going to be, there's going to be a lot of propaganda force against the Mexican army and the Mexican government during this period and after about how brutal they were, because they do execute lots of men at Goliad and the Alamo and other places. But they weren't here to murder women and children. So they're not beasts. They're following orders. And so, yeah, you're going to end up with a 12-day siege. And then on the 13th day, that siege is broken by the battle on the morning of March 6th.
Interesting. Yeah, any time an army or a commander raises the red flag, signaling no quarter, signaling no prisoners, I think the outside world is going to see them as a bit cruel. But I'm glad you brought up Bowie. I'd like to get into Bowie and Travis, which were sort of the two commanders of the Alamo and their relationship, because I know they had a lot of disagreements on who was to lead, so they sort of split leadership and command. Just explain to me that situation between the command of the Alamo, between Bowie and Travis.
Yeah, so they're two different men. James Bowie, is kind of a rough and tumble, a person you definitely didn't want to cross, and Travis is a very young. If you watch the popular films and things like that, Travis is portrayed as pompous. He's arrogant, with very few people who like him. But in fact, he is kind of opposite. He was liked, but I think Hollywood has to make, friction there. But the real issue is that he's over the regulars and Bowie's over the volunteers. That's why command is split after Colonel Neal leaves the fort. And so you have two men who are kind of opposites. One who has Travis, who hasn't seen a ton of combat. James Bowie, who has seen combat and he's been tested, and men see that. Some of the ones who serve with him have seen what he can do in combat under fire, and he's not scared. And so people tend to follow him more. And that's where you get this idea that maybe, people like James Bowie better. Well, he's a tested battle commander. Yeah, if you want to follow someone into battle, you probably want to do it with someone who's not so green. Travis was ambitious, but he was also just very young. 26 years old, so he's a pretty young guy to have full command over a very large fort.
Yeah, that's true. And James Bowie is also what the Bowie knife is named after, correct?
That's right. So James Bowie gets his reputation as a knife fighter. Our research shows he only gotten one knife fight in his entire life. But I tell visitors all the time, it's not really, sometimes it's not how often you do something, it's how you do it, right? And how you do it can be extremely important. And so he gets into a knife fight. He kills one man and he wounds two others. and he's, depending on what account you read, he's stabbed 7 times, he's shot twice, and he lives. Well, that's a pretty tough son of a gun. That story follows him to Texas. He ends up at a place called as a old fort called San Saba, and it's in Menard, Texas, and they get trapped by Comanche, and they're really outnumbered, and they put up a ferocious fight, and the Comanche run off. I mean, they should have died there. There were so few Texans. And then after that, there's the Battle of Concepcion. One after another, Bowie's right in the thick of it, and people, and that sticks to people. There's also the other side of it, is that these volunteers didn't want to take orders from a regular Army officer. It just wasn't ideal. If you're a volunteer, you can not really come and go as you please, but you have a lot more autonomy. Whereas if you're following someone from the government, well, then you have less autonomy.
Yeah, you have to follow orders. I wanna sort of get into the headspace of the defenders of the Alamo, because the Mexican government, Santa Anna, they begin this siege. The Texans know, like you said, the cannon's fired, and now we're going to battle. They know they're gonna have to defend this small outpost with their lives. They're outmanned, they're outgunned. What's the mindset of a Texas defender at the Alamo, knowing that he's gonna have to defend this Alamo with his life?
I think it varies from person to person because, right, we're all different.
Right.
I served in the military. I did combat deployments, but I wasn't out shooting at people. Certainly wasn't getting shot at. And so the headspace I have would be very different to someone who's like an 11 Bravo in the Army who's out in the thick of it. So the men who are on the garrison, they're very different, but they all find themselves in the same position. You have to realize that some of these men had seen combat before, some of them had not. There's an Alamo defender who is 15 years old. That's a kid. Not back then, but today, that's a child. And so his headspace is going to be quite different from James Bowie's, who writes in a letter, there's a myth that Sam Houston orders the Alamo destroyed and blown up. That's a myth. He writes Bowie and says, if you see fit, remove the artillery and destroy the fort. So he's given James Bowie a choice. He writes back and says, I'd rather die in the ditches of the Alamo than let it fall into the hands of the Mexican army. So two different mindsets from two different soldiers in the same position. But there's also a wider idea that people are going to come and reinforce the garrison. Mm-hmm. And so they're holding out hope against hope that someone's going to show and relieve them. They don't know that that's not going to happen. There is a letter that comes in from one of Travis's good friends that says, hold out, help is coming. And so that may have given them a false hope that, these men under, let's say, Fannin at Goliad were going to come to their relief. It wouldn't have made much of a difference, in my opinion, if Fannin had come here. The only difference is that more men would have died on the Alamo side. That death rate would have been higher because ultimately Santana has a much larger force.
They didn't even realize the desperate situation that they were in. It was only them, 189 guys, you said. It was only them. They thought that they were probably going to be getting help, reinforcements, but like we come to find out, that's not going to be the case. But Santa Anna ultimately comes to the decision that he's going to have to take the fort. He moves his troops in, and he does this through the night under the cover of clouds. I know it was like a bright moon or whatever, but it was covered in clouds. So he had the cover of darkness. He had the element of surprise, and he eventually moves his troops to forcibly take the fort. So just walk me through the situation as the battle commences and these Mexican troops take the fort by surprise.
Yeah, the Mexican army over that 12-day siege had been moving closer and closer and closer and closer. I mean, and they were doing it right in front of the Texans, who could watch them move their artillery batteries closer every night. And we have a copy of Santana's original battle orders where he tells his men, General Sesma, who's in charge of the Mexican cavalry, start running cavalry screens around 11 o'clock at night to make sure no one's getting in or out. He tells the other commanders that their men need to have on proper shoes. They need to get rid of anything that'll make noise. They need to carry this much ammunition, and they sneak up to the outer edge of the fort, and it does work. They get so close that they actually find some of the sentries on the Texian side who'd been exhausted from 12 days of siege. They're asleep, and they're killed in their sleep. That's how close the Mexican army gets. It isn't until several of them start screaming "Viva Santa Ana, Viva Mexico" that Texans realize what's happening and gunfire breaks out.
Yeah, so they have the full element of surprise here and catch the defenders off guard. And the battle commences, and I know these Texans fight with so much gallantry and courage and bravery, to defend the Alamo. So just walk me through the fighting. They have to scale the walls. These Alamo defenders are up on the walls shooting down at them, firing cannons at them. Mexicans are taking heavy casualties. What's the situation with the Mexican army taking the fort? How long does it take before the defenders are overrun?
The Mexican army is going to, they have the element of surprise that morning, but they also have another thing working on their side is that they had occupied this fort in December of 1835. So they know the weak points, they know where to hit it. And also, again, they're a trained fighting force. They follow military tactics of the period. And so they're hitting the apex, the points of the fort to make it where they have to stretch, the Texans have to stretch themselves pretty thin, and they're piling on the north wall. That wall, they push twice. The Texans repulse them twice. On the third push, Santana sends in his kind of the cream of the Mexican army, and they shove that attack forward, and the wall is breached. The battle only lasts 30 to 90 minutes, and I'm assuming, and I don't know for sure, and I don't think anyone really knows exactly when the first breach occurs on the north wall, but it has to be pretty early on in the battle, and Travis is killed early on in the battle, so they lose their commander on the north wall. James Bowie is bedridden, so not that I'm not saying the commander would have done a lot of good in the chaos because of the size of the Mexican army and the size of the Texian army, but they lose their commander right off the bat, and so the wall is then breached, and then it's pure and utter chaos. Despite what artists show you of the Battle of the Alamo, where it's bright and there's sun, they're fighting in the dark, and buildings are on fire. There's smoke from the cannon and the muskets, hundreds of them going off. And pure and utter chaos is a very good way of describing that.
God, I can't imagine what it would be like to be in a situation like that. I mean, you mentioned there's a 15-year-old defender, you're a kid, you're fighting in the dark, there's hundreds of people who want to kill you storming over these walls, smoke and fire everywhere, gunfire. It's just, it's mind-boggling for someone like me who, in our generation, we've never seen anything like that. It's very difficult for me to imagine what it would be like in these situations, as a fighting age, male, a military age male, to put myself in these situations of what that would feel like. But going back to Travis, you mentioned he died defending the Alamo. Prior to his death, he wrote a letter, I believe requesting for help or requesting for reinforcements. And in my research, I saw that a historian called it, said it's considered by many as one of the masterpieces of American patriotism. So this Travis letter is sort of one of the iconic symbols that come out of the Alamo. So what exactly was the Travis letter, and why is it so renowned?
The Travis letter, this one you're talking about, is one of the more poetic letters that Travis sends out of the fort with couriers like James Butler Bonham and many others. He writes a series of letters asking for help. He's also telling them the general state and affair of the fort. And this one just happens to be kind of the last ditch effort, or at least one of them. And he's calling on all Texans, but he's also calling on all Americans in the world to do their patriotic duty and come to the Alamo's defense. That letter is sent out by courier, and then there's copies made, and then they spread like wildfire. And it's another myth that I think is worth mentioning, is that this letter is very poetic, but it doesn't do any good, and that's not true. It's actually very false, because men hear about this, but the way that communication spread at that time was very slow. And by the time men heard and they start grabbing their firearms, and getting their kits ready, and they're heading down to Texas. The Battle of the Alamo is over with, but they show up, some of them, for in time for the actual Battle of San Jacinto, which is the final battle of the Revolution. And then some of them even show up afterwards and join the newly formed Texas military, which is under our own government and as a nation. And so the letter actually does a lot of good. It just doesn't help the garrison.
So it's a huge morale booster and patriotic symbol for the defenders to come. But like you said, it doesn't necessarily help the situation and the conflict at hand. But many in the audience have probably been wondering what's on my head this entire episode, and I'm wearing the iconic, Davy Crockett raccoon hat. So I'd like to get into Davy Crockett, who is quite possibly the most famous person or instance to come out of the Alamo. He's been so romanticized and made iconic throughout American history. So who was Davy Crockett?
David Crockett is a three-time congressman from the state of Tennessee who loses his fourth bid in Congress and ends up immigrating into Texas. He's not here very long, just a handful of months before he loses his life at the Battle of the Alamo, and he will be used as somewhat of as a propaganda tool, in my opinion, to further demonize the Mexican army and get people to join the Texian cause, and it works very well. People have to remember that he was kind of the Elvis of his time. He was very, very, very popular. He had books written about him. He had plays written about him. The other thing about it is that America was still in its infancy as a nation. Having won our independence, very early on, and then the Alamo happens not long after that. The American identity has not been fully established. What is an American? Some people we still didn't know at this period, and is it George Washington? Is it someone like that? And Crockett kind of steps forward and becomes a major part of the American identity. And so whenever he dies at the Battle of the Alamo, some people, it may have felt like they had lost a piece of America, right? Or at least, the idea of what an American was. And so it likely spurred people on to go and fight and join the Texian army. It certainly upsets people that he may have been executed after the battle without a firearm and is killed without being able to defend himself. So, yeah, he becomes this larger-than-life character. And then he's further developed and kind of explodes under Fess Parker, who played him, and then John Wayne. And so he really becomes this iconic American symbol, but it's not something that was done recently. He was a symbol of America even during his lifetime. And so shows you the power that he had over the people.
That's a fantastic point, because you're absolutely right. I mean, the United States as a nation is still very young. They're still finding their identity. I mean, when we look back now, we have so many larger-than-life figures that have shaped the American identity and shaped American history. But at that time, you have the Revolutionary War heroes, you have George Washington, but America still yearns for figures to look up to, especially, closer to their time. And Davy Crockett, I think, fills that very well, especially, like you mentioned, he's sort of a propagandized figure to bolster American morale and American patriotism. But he fights valiantly at the Battle of the Alamo. I think it may be a myth, but I saw a little story that said when they found his body, he was surrounded by like 13 Mexican soldiers with just a knife in his hand to show how bravely and how fiercely he fought at the Alamo.
Yeah, we don't know how he died. We don't know if he was fought in the battle and then was shot and killed in the early minutes of the battle or latter part of the battle, or if he was executed. I have read accounts that he had taken out several men. Again, someone with combat experience. He was a fighter, and so it is likely that he took several people with him.
Interesting, and it's interesting to hear that even during his lifetime, he was an iconic, romanticized figure. We look back and we may think that this sort of identity and iconic figure came from the movies and the stories that were written about him, but even during his lifetime, he was sort of an iconic romanticized figure.
Yeah, not an easy thing to do, especially for someone who, ran away from home very early on and had, less than a year's worth of education in his lifetime. It's pretty powerful.
Yeah, it's definitely a testament to who he was as a person. But the Mexican army eventually takes the Alamo. I know the defenders are sort of forced into the church to make a last stand. What are the last moments looking like at the Battle of the Alamo with the last couple defenders and the Mexican army eventually taking the garrison?
Yeah, it would have been. I used the word complete and utter, or the words complete and utter chaos already, but it would have been nightmarish. It really would have. I mean, imagine going into a dark room with a bayonet on the end of your musket, discharging your musket, and then feeling around in the dark for a warm body to kill. I mean, that's what's happening. The Texans inside the church are said to have turned the gun on the Mexican army who were coming through the front door and letting loose with a cannon, which I know we think of the guns back during this period as being very archaic, but I tell you that that would have been devastating to whoever's coming through that doorway if they were hit by that ball, or if it was grape shot, it had cut them right in half. And then the men fighting the Lawn Barrack, they fought to the death in trenches that they had pre-dug inside that building, and they're fighting in the dark again. So pretty nasty stuff. Not really anything you can compare that to in modern warfare.
Yeah, and when we look back at sort of battles like this, we see paintings and artistic renditions of what the battle would have looked like. And you mentioned earlier it's sunshine, and you see it's a fierce battle, but it's lit up. And I think you explained it very well. I mean, can you imagine being in a dark room with a bayonet, and there's people who are coming in wanting to kill you, and you're in absolute darkness? You don't know. It's confusion. It's chaos. It's just no artistic rendition is going to be able to do it justice, I think. But there's an instance from the Battle of the Alamo called the Runaway Scrape. What exactly was the Runaway Scrape?
The Runaway Scrape was basically after the fall of the Alamo, and then the men who were massacred at Goliad. Um, to step back, the men who were going to these places to fight, what did they leave behind? Women and children. Well, now they've all died. So you have roughly 500 men under Fannin, if I remember correctly, and then you have 189 dying at the Battle of the Alamo. So about 700 families, roughly, that have no male to guide them. And this is a male-driven world at the time. We know that.
Yeah.
So what happens is Sam Houston, now he has control over the regulars and the volunteers, starts to try to get this army together, and then they're dealt two very serious blows in a row. So he begins to take everyone and retreating back toward the United States, and they're running away, and they're also burning down entire towns, San Felipe de Austin, Gonzales, and they're taking these women and children with them, basically with the clothes on their back and the things they can carry. And it's a very scary period, but I'll tell you, this is part of the reason why Texas women are so patriotic and strong, why organizations like the Dodge Republic of Texas exist, because those women are the ones that carried on the story and carried the torch of Texas, onto the final defeat of the Mexican army in April of 1836. So the Runaway Scrape is basically the Texans trying to save their hides and retreat further north in hopes that they can gather an army up to defeat Santa Anna.
Wow. Yeah, looking back at the Alamo and the Texas Revolution, you can really see how and why Texas people are so tough. You can look back at their history and their heritage and trace it all the way back to their roots, because obviously Texas people have a reputation of being very tough and resilient and strong, and you can see exactly why that is. And it's so amazing to hear that organizations like you just mentioned, the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, can trace their roots all the way back to the women who were fleeing from the Mexican army, who continued that legacy and carried those stories with them. And you see that permeate throughout history and throughout generations. And that legacy is still being upheld today, which is so great to see. But Santa Anna obviously had his policy of no quarter, taking no prisoners. Were there any survivors from the Alamo?
Yeah, there are. There are 15 to 20 women and children who survived the Alamo. There's also a slave who belonged to William Barrett Travis. He's 18 to 23 years old. His name is Joe. Early on, as early as the end of March, they're printing in local newspapers that this is likened to Thermopylae in the Battle of Thermopylae. And they're saying that Thermopylae had its messenger, the Alamo had none. Well, in fact, there are women and children who are going to carry on that story, and that's where we build part of our narrative that we talk to visitors about today. You talked about Texas as well just a minute ago, how proud Texans are, which is very true. We're very patriotic people. But there's actually, let me see if I can find it here. Oh gosh. Well, I can't find for some reason, I can't find my mouse on my computer, but there's a quote by Jefferson Davis, and I'll kind of just paraphrase it, but basically he's getting ready for a large battle during the Civil War. And he's talking about how, the men need to show themselves that day. And they said there were plenty of Texans who were there that day. And he says, unlike you all, or unlike, sorry, let me get, I found it. Let me see here. It says, the troops of Texas have their reputations to gain, but the sons of defenders of the Alamo have theirs to maintain. And so basically he's saying these other states, they got to prove themselves. Texas has already done that. We have to maintain who we are. We have to maintain what we've already earned. And he calls us the sons of the Alamo, which is, I think, is really telling. And anytime Texans are there, I think people feel a little bit more safe. Because me and my colleague, we joke about it. It's like Texans don't know when to quit. The Battle of Pea Ridge is a great example where, the flank folds, the middle folds, and the Texans are pushed all the way forward. They just don't have any quit in them. And, it's a Texas thing, I guess.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's extremely poetic, and I think you're absolutely right. Texans don't know when to quit. I used to be, as a kid, I always wanted to be a Navy SEAL, and so I read a lot of the books from the Navy SEAL guys, and I looked into, the history of Navy SEALs and what it's like to go to BUDS and all that. And one of the most striking observations I had was a huge amount of guys who made it through BUDS were from Texas. And it just shows you that fighting, resilient spirit of Texans don't know when to quit.
That's right. Yeah, it's really become a fabric of the Texan identity.
Yeah, 100%. So following the Battle of the Alamo, how did the rest of the Texas Revolution play out? You can just give me a Cliff Notes version. Following the Alamo, Santa Anna, I'm assuming, continues on to San Antonio. But as we know, the Texans sort of come out on top here and establish their own republic that eventually becomes part of the United States. So how does the rest of this conflict play out?
Yeah, the rest of the conflict is that Santa Anna leaves a small force of Mexican soldiers to clean up the Alamo, and then basically they use it as a fort, so they're holding it. He takes the bulk of his army outside of modern day Houston, and they fight a very brutal battle in April of 1836. Of course, the Texans are victorious at that battle, and Santa Anna is captured, and he signs over Texas and gives us our independence, and then we become a sovereign nation for roughly 10 years until we joined the Union in 1845 as a 28th state. So the Cliff Notes version of the Texas Revolution is already done because it's in roughly 11 months, and it's very quick. So the revolution in itself is a cliff note in American history. But when you look at the impact it has on our nation, it cannot be understated, because after Texas is annexed, it causes the Mexican War, and it ends up meaning that Mexico cedes over roughly half of their territory, and it changes our nation forever. Without the Alamo, you have none of that.
Wow. That's so profound the way you put that. Without the Alamo, we would have had none of that, because you're right. I mean, following the Mexican-American War, we got a lot of land. I believe it's our second biggest land gain aside from the Louisiana Purchase.
Yeah. So, the funny thing about that is Louisiana Purchase is touted as, well, they really didn't know what they bought with Louisiana Purchase, because when they asked Louisiana, what is it? Louisiana's like, well, I don't know. They just claimed it, And so they pick on Jefferson and say, you purchased the Great American Desert. Well, what actually happens here is that they did get the Great American Desert, the American Southwest, and it is a gigantic swath of territories that encompass New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, California, and portions of Colorado, Wyoming, Kansas, and Oklahoma. I mean, that's a ton of territory, and it solidifies our border with our southern neighbor forever.
Yeah, I mean, it basically doubles the size of the United States at that time, and it's so you're right. I mean, it's so profound to look back at this and say, without the Alamo, you would have had none of this. And I think that's just a testament to the importance of the Battle of the Alamo and its legacy. And obviously, it's super important when it comes to Texas pride and Texas heritage, which I think we've done a good job of explaining. But really, it's extremely important to American legacy and American heritage as a whole. Absolutely influential in shaping our nation. But you mentioned earlier in the conversation that the Alamo would continue to have a very important and profound legacy and role in American history, many other conflicts to follow. So I'd like to just give you the floor to explain kind of how the Alamo's legacy continued.
Yeah, so of course, after the fall of the Mexican army and the defeat of Santana in April, by May, the Mexican troops inside the Alamo have torn down many of the walls, buried most of the cannon, carried a few off with them, and they retreat into Mexico. Texas becomes a sovereign nation, but their problems are not over. They're going to inherit those that were left behind by the Mexican army and the Spanish before them. They cannot secure their borders. They have the Comanche coming down from the north. They've got the Apache coming in from the west, and they've got all kinds of issues in between. They've got no real formal army. Their navy ends up rotting in the docks and dry dock, and it's they also have no real specie at all as far as currency, and so their government flounders, and the people of Texas are hardened by that in a lot of ways, and it further just shows what Texans are. But the Alamo becomes vacant for many years until 1845, whenever we become the 28th state. The U.S. Army moves in, and they need a hub for their quartermaster depot. There are about 20 plus forts who end up being supplied by the U.S. Army from the quartermaster depot at the Alamo. And because it's being used by the Army, rented out from the Catholic Church, the Alamo is saved from progress and expansionism that comes from across the river. And it isn't leveled like many of the other historic buildings in San Antonio. And then around the 1890s, the state of Texas sees the importance of the structure, along with the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, and they save it, and it becomes a museum in 1905.
Wow. Well, thank God they didn't level it because you'd be out of a job.
Yeah, that's right. Good job, security, on their part for me.
Yeah, exactly. But Kolby, I want to thank you so much for coming on. This was such a profound conversation. I really enjoyed it. Really gives you a lot of insight into what makes Texans Texans. You know what I mean? But where can the audience go to learn more about the Alamo and maybe plan a visit to the Alamo?
Yeah, if you want to plan a visit, you can go on to our website at thealamo.org, and you can look at all the cool things we're going through. We're in the middle of one of, if not the largest museum projects in the entire United States right now. Things are changing. If you've been to the Alamo in the past, before 2 years ago, you have not seen the new Alamo. We've retained, obviously, the original buildings and what it is to be a Texan. That identity is still there. But we've added a new museum. We're adding a second, larger structure. And so it's worth coming to visit us. Secondly, if you want to learn about projects that are ongoing, you can go listen to our website. Or sorry, our podcast on our website. And it's a fantastic way to learn about new projects and get more of our site's history. I appreciate you having me on. I'm glad that I was able to share our site's history and our story with you.
Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing. I 100% have the Alamo on my bucket list. I will be making it out there one day, but I'm going to have all that stuff you mentioned linked in the description, so you guys can go check that out. But Kolby, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jake. Have a good one.